Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Talking Christianity Apologetics. My name is Josh Gibbs, and today we are doing a debate review with Dr. Stephen Boyce. He is going to be participating in this debate review as a critical text proponent with Jonathan Sheffield, who's going to be representing the TR side. And the debate was between Dr. Boyce and Dr. Riddle about a week ago, with the topic being the pericope adulterae in John 7:53 through 8:11, which the thesis that we had for that debate is this: is the PA an authentic part of John's gospel? The PA should be rejected on external, internal, and historical grounds. And obviously we had Stephen, who took the affirmative and went first, while Jeff took the negative and he went second. But stay tuned with us. We'll be right back after this brief introduction video, and we're going to have Dr. Boyce and Jonathan Sheffield here to review that debate and to give two different perspectives on the PA, one from a TR view with Jonathan Sheffield, and then the critical text view with Stephen Boyce. So stay with us just a second, and we'll be right back.
Make sure today that you leave this place knowing that you are saved to the glory of God.
Thinks that one I'm going to choose. If you believe that, friends, you don't know the gospel.
Is that the wonder of the cross is that no one gets injustice. If you end up under the wrath of God, it is because you've rejected His provision for you, and you are justly punished for your sin.
To what the scriptures teach. I think the Bible does teach that God desires the salvation of all men, and He has provided for the salvation of all men. And therefore, anyone who ends up under the wrath of God, it is because they have rejected His provision for them, and they are justly punished for their sins.
The question that seeks to provide an answer to this question: for whose sins did Jesus die? The extent of the atonement asks the question, for whose sins did Jesus die? There are only two possible answers to that question. Either Jesus died for the sins of some people, or Jesus died for the sins of all people.
All right, so I'm going to give you guys a brief rundown on what to expect in the upcoming weeks, upcoming episodes, before we jump into this with Dr. Boyce and Jonathan. So what's coming this week actually is going to be not an eschatology debate, it's a Eucharist between myself and Matthew Broderick. That'll be on the 31st at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Then after that, I've got an eschatology debate coming up on the 14th between myself and Stacy Turbeville, and that's June 14th. Then Kevin Thompson's going to come on the 28th at 2 p.m. We're going to be talking Calvinism, some of the tough questions about Calvinism, predestination, election, adoption, just some of the general terms that you'll have in a conversation between a Calvinist and non-Calvinist that predominantly takes place in Ephesians 1, Romans 8, Romans 9, Ephesians 2, and John 6. So we'll see where we go when it comes to that side of the conversation. And then we've got one more that we're working on. We'll see how it ends up, but if it's able to happen, that'll be a debate with Dr. Boyce on total inability. But stay tuned for that. I'll be able to give you more information as that comes up. So let me cut over here to my interview scene. And for those of you who are still watching, I do want to let you know, if you could help us to get this message out there for the live stream, for those who would like to watch it live rather than going back and tuning in later. Facebook obviously doesn't allow us to share the stream to multiple groups at one time anymore, so it takes a lot longer to get the word out there. If you could help out with that and just share it to your timeline or your news feed, or like it or subscribe, all of that good stuff, just help get the message out there. But anyways, I think that's about all I've got. I do want to let you know also, if you prefer to watch or listen on audio platforms as opposed to the video platforms, you can do that as well on Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, all the major audio podcasting platforms as well. So anyways, let's go ahead and get into it today. We're doing the debate review, and we're going to go through the video, but I want to get Dr. Boyce in here and Jonathan as well, and kind of get an update on where you guys have been and then we'll jump into it. But Dr. Boyce, thanks again for coming back to do this debate review with Jonathan Sheffield. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming on tonight as well. So it's good to have you both.
Oh, thank you,
Josh. Good to be on again.
And actually, I got a notification earlier that Dr. Boyce, you were doing another debate review, and kind of another mini debate with Leighton Flowers. So it seems like anytime you're doing a broadcast with Leighton, that you're going to follow it up with a broadcast with me. But I don't know how you're doing it. I mean, 2 of these things in one day like that's just crazy.
It's a lot. In fact, with Dr. Flowers, ended up going almost 3 hours today. That was unplanned. Yesterday, I had an interview with a apologetics podcast on Ken. So I ended up doing that for a place, actually apologetics channel in Malaysia.
Wow, that's crazy.
Don't ask me where that came from. It was just an opportunity I took. And then tonight, obviously, we're having this review. Yeah. So it's been a long week. It's been a very long week.
Yeah, and Jonathan, you've got some pretty exciting news coming up. I don't know, can you announce what's going on with you yet?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
So starting this Friday, March 29th, I will be debating Dr. Richard Carrier. This will be my second debate with Dr. Richard Carrier. But this one is going to be on the topic of the resurrection and dealing with my question that I posed. Why weren't the rulers of the Roman Empire able to falsify the resurrection of Jesus? So I've already submitted my opening statement to Dr. Carrier, and he'll be posting it on his blog at richardcarrier.org this Friday. And he will be following up with that response on Saturday. It is an open platform, so others are able to go in there and participate in the comments section. And that debate will last probably for about 2 weeks. And then we're going to have our post-debate recap and kind of rehash our arguments on modern-day debate sometime at the end of June. So definitely looking forward to that discussion.
Very cool. That's exciting. That's awesome, man. So, well, I've got to ask: are you going to turn that into? Are you going to be able to publish that as one of your videos that you usually do?
Yes. So that will make for another cartoon. I'm already working on the cartoon right now for my debate with Matt Dillahunty on the 4 gospel authors. So once I finish up with that production, I will move into my cartoon recreation of my debate with Carrier. So that should be a fun production.
That's awesome. Yeah, so go check that out, guys. Follow Jonathan on that as well. And if you haven't had a chance to, go to Soteriology 101 and listen to that original debate that Dr. Boyce had with Leighton Flowers about a week ago as well. I messaged Stephen after the debate. I'm like, dude, that was one of the top 5 debates in my opinion, just because the conversation flowed so good. It felt like you guys really hit some really good points in that conversation, and it just seemed like to me, man, that's one to check out if you're into debates, if you're into watching that kind of stuff with 2 guys that hit each other hard but still kept it fresh. That's a good debate to watch. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump into this. We've got a few different points that we're going to examine, and I think as we go through it, I'll play the video, and then you and Jonathan are going to interact between the 2 of you, and I'll just kind of sit back and listen and guide it unless something comes to mind, and I think I want to bring it up. But it should predominantly be between the 2 of you, and then obviously, Jonathan, you're representing a TR side from a little different angle. You've got more of a historical angle from the ecclesiastical side of saying, well, where's the chain of custody? It seems like to me your argument is primarily the chain of custody and what was received in the churches and accepted in the churches and was kind of circulated throughout the church world back then. So, and then Stephen, so.
I wanted to say really quick why when you and I talked, Josh, and I want the audience to know this, I was astonished that at the end of the debate, I went back and counted the amount of Facebook messages, text messages from family and friends that had already sent me a response to the debate before I even clicked end call. People have to realize most of my contacts are TR. I grew up in the TR movement. More than half my family is TR. Half my friends list is TR. And so I was getting a response from those people. And it was very, very different from some of the responses I was seeing on Facebook. And so when Josh, you and I talked about maybe doing a review, it dawned on me. I was like, I'm going to check with Jonathan on this because I want to bring somebody on to review it who's unbiased and actually disagrees with me. And so Jonathan doesn't share the same position that I do, but I know that in a review, he's going to be neutral on this because he can't side with my position, but he also has, a good character about him where he's going to be fair. So I thought it was important enough to do that. And I didn't want to have somebody just come on here and say, you were right, because that's not really a good, fair review.
Yeah. Dude, I've got to say, to me, that speaks volumes about kind of you and your character, because who wants to have a debate review with someone who's going to disagree with them? If I had the choice, dude, I'm bringing somebody on who agrees with me. We're going to get a bunch of yeses. But no. Anyway, so that's good, Jonathan. I'm glad that you accepted and said you'd be willing to do this. So that we'll have a little bit of back and forth and some good, profitable dialogue. And I think that's going to be edifying for everybody who watches. So, all right, let's get into it. I'll cut to the 9-minute mark here in the video. You guys should be able to see this on the screen. This should be, I think this is a rebuttal period. I could be wrong, but I think it's a rebuttal period. So I'll just play it. We're going to go to the 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 hour and 5 minute marks. And you guys just tell me when to stop and when you want to make a comment.
Yeah, run this one up to about a minute and 2, and I'll tell you when we can discuss it.
Okay, perfect. Here we go.
And it's mentioned in Luke and as well. I think it's perhaps also it's in it's in Matthew and Mark also, where there's a reference to after the Last Supper, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Audio.
Well, given that John doesn't have a record.
Can you guys hear the audio?
No, it's kind of choppy.
Yeah.
It's real choppy on my end too.
Dang, that's real choppy.
And while you're doing that, I can go ahead and it's hard to hear it, but what he was talking about was the Mount of Olives right there, because one of the words that I had mentioned in my article, not even in my introduction, and before we kind of get into the video and Jonathan can share his view of this, I was actually a little bit disappointed at how much of my introduction and opening statement was not covered in the cross-examination. I would actually say most of the points that I touched on were not covered in the discussion time of transferring questions. Most of his questions came from my article, which I think was grossly misrepresented. And the study and the theory that I was going after and building off of. And one of the words that I bring up is that the Mount of Olives is not a place listed by John. And Dr. Riddle was claiming the fact that are you insinuating that John didn't know this mountain existed? And it's like, well, it did, as much as me living in South Carolina knows North Carolina exists. I obviously am very aware that it's familiar with the location. The question is in a small section of John, there's a large amount of words that we do not see anywhere else. And the Mount of Olives is a place that John does not reference in his gospel. In relation to in my article, which was not really, again, presented very fairly, I was comparing the Johannine words or the non-Johannine words with the Lucan words that were in reference to the work that Kyle Hughes did, which we'll talk about his work a little bit later. And that if you go to Luke chapter number 21, where the family 13 manuscripts have this story, right in that section, the introduction of a few of the words are the same. The idea of the Mount of Olives, or through the same terminology there was used by Luke for early in the morning, whereas John did not use that Greek term for early in the morning. He used a different term all the way up to the resurrection of Jesus in John 20. He used a different Greek term, but Luke did use that. And if you were to go to Luke chapter 21, verse 38, it says, then early in the morning, same word that's in the pericope, he went out and stayed on the Mount of Olives, which is the same phrase used in the pericope. And then it says right there, it introduces the story. If you look at verse 53 of John 7, it reads very similar to how Luke introduces that section that's in the Family 13 manuscripts. That point was the main emphasis of the Mount of Olives. It's not that I implied that the Mount of Olives was absent from the mind and knowledge of John. It's that the syntax as a whole seemed to fit in the introduction there to Luke. Jonathan, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, I know a lot of the focus during the cross-examination, impression on your opening argument where you were trying to establish a history and origin for the passage. You brought up Papias. You brought up, a lot of the external evidence that sides with the exclusion of this verse. And, you did touch on the, internal evidence, but you also suggested that obviously this is speculative. It doesn't really, it can be interpreted either ways, and this doesn't really drive home the position on where this needs to go. So I thought from my standpoint that maybe a little too much time was invested by Dr. Riddle into cross-examination on a very speculative nature of the debate, and it lost an opportunity for Dr. Riddle maybe to spend more on the internal evidence, its history and transmission through the official churches of the apostles, and it's as it's being invested in their scriptures and lectionaries. So from my standpoint, I think it was just an opportunity lost to really focus on the external evidence where a greater case could have been made for its originality to John.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to have to do until I get a computer that has got a better video processor. I think what I'll do is just play the audio only on my Mac Pro, which
sure
you guys will be able to hear it. You won't be able to see it on the screen, but
that's fine.
That's fine.
That's fine.
It'll still get the job done. So, anyways, all right, here we go.
Well, I think it's perhaps also it's in Matthew and Mark also, where there's a reference to after the Last Supper, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Well, given that John doesn't have a record of the Last Supper, it's not surprising that the phrase Mount of Olives doesn't appear in that text. The other thing to take into consideration is, if we believe that the author of the Gospel of John was John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, don't we think that John the Apostle would know what the Mount of Olives is as a place? Wouldn't he know that Jesus often went there? So if John the Apostle is the author of John 7:53 through 11, it's not surprising that he knows that term. And so that would be one example of an argument that Stephen makes that just doesn't make sense, quite frankly.
Okay, if you could pause it right there. And that kind of goes back to what we were just describing, is he's misrepresenting a massive amount of research on a big plane in a small sentence. As I demonstrated that the Family 13 manuscripts was the main pursuit in that part of the article, which, by the way, was not in my presentation. I didn't even mention that in my presentation. There's a bigger work that was being done in that section of the article, and that was taking the Luke syntax, the Johannine syntax. It was looking at them side by side. It was examining the 7 Lucanisms that Kyle Hughes had found doing a master's thesis for Dr. Dan Wallace. And I actually found 3 additional Lucanisms in the pericope that Kyle didn't have in his list. And I was comparing them to the introduction of that section that the manuscripts of Family 13 have in Luke's Gospel, showing the introduction is consistent with the Mount of Olives there more than it is in the passage of Scripture that Jesus was being portrayed there in the text. And to just be said as well, and I'm sure this will come up as well, the article was meant to chase a theory that was being presented in the academic world. And anybody that reads the article, I even stated that no conclusion can be made on the syntax alone, and that even in those discoveries, I still did not affirm it belonged in Luke. But it was also tied into the fact of how many Lucanisms attached themselves to the way the Didascalia document quoted the story and attached those words to Didascalia, following Kyle Hughes's lead on that, which, by the way, Kyle Hughes had published. I feel like Kyle Hughes was kind of put down a little bit in some of the discussion I saw. Kyle Hughes had his word published in the academic side of things. In fact, Dr. Riddle had mentioned Keith's work on this. And I don't know if Dr. Riddle knows this, but Keith and Kyle Hughes had a conversation. You can actually find it on the internet. They had a dialogue with each other Kyle Hughes apparently sent his work to Keith. And Keith actually said that none of the information would necessarily change his position, but it should be considered, and it was excellent work. And he was actually giving praise to Dan Wallace for signing different kinds of things like that to his students to do investigation work on. So Keith did not look at that and say, well, this is just pointless. Or Keith didn't look at that and say, well, that's just a weak argument. That's a weak theory. Keith looked at it and said, yeah, it doesn't really change my position, Kyle, but that's great work and it needs to be discussed in the evidence. But even Kyle Hughes does not affirm that it belongs in Luke's gospel. We're trying to trace the origin of why did the scribes of Family 13, which, yes, are probably around 1000, 1200 AD, which most that have discovered and researched the Family 13 believe the mother manuscript is 7th century. Why did that manuscript edition put it in that place? And is there syntactical reason to believe that? So it needs to be understood that section in my paper was, in my opinion, grossly misrepresented and treated as a terrible, weak view when it's actually an academic view that's been published and even Keith has acknowledged should be considered.
So let me see if I can sum this argument up, and I want to toss it back to you, Jonathan, and see if you want to go with this, because it seems like to me what Riddle is arguing for is the internal support for this being the autograph from John, that John wrote it. And you're saying, well, it looks like it's more Lucan because of the external support showing where they placed it in the Family 13 manuscripts. And not only that, but the specific wording, it looks like it might be Lucan as far as its origin, as far as the wording. It looks like it might be Lucan as far as the placement from this family of manuscripts. And Jeff is saying, well, it looks like to me that it would be Johannine. It looks like it's the wording that John would have used because he's used it elsewhere. And so he's looking at it from more of an internal internal support for his argument in referencing the Mount of Olives. But and that's just my take from looking at it from the outside. But Jonathan, you guys have got more knowledge about this than I do. So what's your take on it as far as Jeff's argument on the internal? And it seems like he might be missing a little bit of the external references on where the placement is in the Family 13 manuscripts.
Yeah, I guess first off, just to comment on the Mount of Olives statement. I mean, we do have documentation from Eusebius reviewing the history that John was aware of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He did have time. It was in his churches, which shows that it was authorized. So he was familiar with their works, and he approved of what had already been written before he set out to write his. So obviously he had time to obviously digest what was already provided by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In terms of the placement of the pericope adulterae at the end of the Luke, from my standpoint, this really goes into the very nature of the history of the lections, the canons, that was set up very early by the ancient churches. As an Anglican, we subscribe to the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. It's the way our churches are set up and organized to review scriptures. And this is nothing against Dr. Riddle, but I believe he comes from a tradition outside of the liturgical ecclesiastical bodies, such as the Greek Orthodox, the Anglican Communion, or the Roman Catholic, that uses this system or lection cycle as part of its divine liturgy. And, when we look at and we find the lection where the PA is actually found at the end of Luke, it is an issue. It's something that we do have to investigate. Now, all that I would like to say, kind of quickly as we touch on the lection cycle, is we know that the lectionaries, the way the apostolic churches were ordering their service in order to deliver the message of salvation to its congregation was set up very early. We know from Eusebius that there was already a dispute at the beginning of the 2nd century between the churches of Asia Minor and Rome on its celebration of the date of Easter. So it pinpoints at the beginning of the 2nd century that the East and the West were on an opposite cycle for how they were conducting their divine liturgy and their order of service. We see this back in 190 on the Passover with Pope Victor I. Eusebius is setting up canons in the 4th century, especially in light of the system that was set up in Alexandria. And he has in his letter to Copernicus, what his intention was for setting up his canons. And we even see Constantine writing to the different churches in the 4th century after Nicaea to try to get everyone on the same page. So when I look at the lection cycle, and what I can gather from it is even later into Christianity, as other groups like the Georgian Church, the Armenians are developing their lection cycles. They're obviously looking at some of this information and they're setting up their order of service. So for me personally, when I look at and see why something is, the PA is being placed in Luke at the end, it really dictates from how they're bookmarking, how their order of service would be. Now, why at the end of Luke? For me, and once again, this is just my understanding just from the history, but it is my speculation, is that at the end of Luke, and we see that in the Eastern Orthodox churches, they're assigning it to the Feast of Pelagius on October 8th. So it seems to indicate for me that you're trying to associate this passage with the Day of Repentance. So they're trying to associate that where the woman in adultery actually repented to kind of ease the minds of the congregation. So from my standpoint, obviously it is an issue. Why would we find it at the end of Luke? But as we can see, we find it at the end of John in its usual location. For me, what best explains that is the diverse lectionary cycle system that we find throughout the Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Georgian churches.
Yeah, and to add into that, I agree that a lot of the movement that happens in the manuscripts because of the lectionaries, especially in John 7, and then it's pushed later in John 8 in places, I do think that is due to the lectionary placements. And maybe the only part that Jonathan and I would differ on is I don't think that actually answers Luke's placement. I know that there's arguments that are made for it, that it's due to that. I think that there's a syntactical argument to be made as well. And obviously Dr. Wallace Kyle Hughes did as well. And the investigation took itself from there. But again, it needs to be noted that there were a lot of terms that John did not usually use. And again, I try to get Dr. Riddle to understand this in the debate. It's not just one or two words, because he would mention like, well, the sons of Zebedee is only mentioned this one time in Luke. Yeah, but you're talking about the whole book. I'm talking about in a 12-verse section. You're talking about 12 words, like the grammates, the scribes. You're talking about orthru for the word early in the morning in the Mount of Olives. And there's a lot of things, not just one or two. And to clear it up, and if anybody wants to go back and read the article as well, I made it very clear that the forms of the words that were used here, not that John wasn't familiar with the words, although there are specific words in this story not used by any New Testament writer. In fact, it would be considered more classical Greek in a couple places, specifically about where Jesus was writing on the ground. But overall, most of the words that are used here were not used in this form. And that was very important to note, the form that it was used in here. Not that John didn't know the word or use a different form of it later. But again, you got to remember, in the article, I'm attaching it to a second chart of Luke. Luke used this form in the same locations and areas that the manuscripts of Family 13 have the story. So it's connecting it back to that. And again, I was chasing a theory in that part of the article. I was not making a conclusion, and connecting its wording to how it similarly read to the Didascalia document, the Syrian Didascalia document. And so there was more going on to it than me making an assertion. And I guess the part that I guess I was most disappointed in was that the question time, almost all 15 minutes, were in relation to this one aspect, which would have took me 15 minutes or so, like it has, to explain that whole section of the article, when I gave numerous talking points in my introduction that we didn't even get to touch on, as Jonathan mentioned. But if we could go into that next section, Josh.
Yeah, let's do that.
Plain audio.
Okay, so this is going to pick up where we left off, and I think it's going to start out with me talking. So we'll just. Hey, all right, thanks guys for the rebuttal. And now we are going to transition into our cross-examination. This is where the negative is going to go first. So Dr. Riddle, you will be first to question Dr. Boyce. I'm going to reset the clock here.
Let me just start with my question that I asked you about Codex Alexandrinus. Were you aware of the fact that there's a gap there, and it's neither a witness for or against the pericope adulteri?
Yes, I've examined Codex Alexandrinus very closely, actually, in much of my work, and there is a massive gap there, and it has been estimated by the words of usage and so forth that it would not fit there. Also, one of the other reasons that it is rejected, because Alexandrinus has a unique setup of chapter content that is given for its reader, and it's not listed as a marking of the chapter content in the manuscript. Dr. Wallace has affirmed the same thing, that this story would not have fit in that narrative of the gap that is there. Yes, that section is missing. I've examined the manuscript very closely, but it would not fit. We can show how it wouldn't have fit, and also it wasn't listed in the chapter, and using that word loose, chapter contents that were given. There were 18 chapters in the book of John there in that manuscript.
But given that there is that big gap there, you cannot, in fact, say definitively that Codex Alexandrinus is a witness to the omission of the pericope adulteri. That's correct, right?
Well, since I don't use absolute certain terms, I would say there's a good possibility. So back to the evidence. Would it fit? Can we prove it fit? Can we do the science and put words there like they did on the Codex, proven, like, for example, and I don't want to get into this, the long ending of Mark, there was a theory that, there was room for it. Well, that theory's been disproven based on size and font and usage, and it would actually have overlapped. We can do things like that to come up with a good reason. Would I stand on a chopping block for it? No.
Can you pause it right there, Josh?
Yeah, so
right, a couple things.
Let me ask you this real quick. It seems like this is one point in the debate that some people have said, well, why would Stephen take this position if he's not willing to stand on the chopping block for it? If it is a great evidence that the PA should not be included, when some people speculate that even if it doesn't fit in there with the text, the font, the size, and all of that, with the space that is given, that it could be for a memorial for the election cycle or something like that. But But what would your response be to those who would say this is a point against Stephen that, it seems like he's conceding to this somewhat?
Well, first, I thought I saw a question down there about the syntax. Was there a decision made? I want to be clear. I don't think you can make any decision on the work of the pericope on the syntax. I think it should be in the discussion, but I don't think we should make any final decision off of syntactical usages or lack of. Again, that was me testing the theory of the Family 13 manuscripts. But to your question, Josh, and I think Jonathan, I think Jonathan would agree with this. There's a lot of things that have heavy weighted evidence that I'm not willing to have my head chopped off for, because I don't want to deal in absolute certainty. Here's what we do know. Even Bergen was interested in this manuscript, and he was interested in fitting, not fitting, and he really couldn't make a decision. But a man by the name of Cowper suggested that it would not have fit. And there's actually a guy named Andrew Smith at Sheffield Seminary up, I think near Raleigh or Durham, the seminary up there. He did extensive work duplicating and remodifying and font sizing, and he has proven and worked through the manuscript, and because we say it's a massive gap. Basically, the gap is pretty much from John 6:51, close to John 6:51, and ending somewhere around John 8:52. It's a total of 3 leaves, if I'm not mistaken. If my memory serves me correct, don't pin me on this, but I'm pretty sure it's 3 leaves front and back that are missing. It's about 2 chapters missing. It's not like we're missing half the book. We're missing just a section there, and it wouldn't take much to figure out whether or not 12 entire verses would have been re-modified into that or taken out. So, since Cowper had a theory, Andrew Smith ran that theory and did the work, extensive work on the manuscript, and determined that it would have required additional pages in order to put that story in there. I have not met a textual critic yet that would even entertain the idea that it could have fit in that manuscript. Tommy Wasserman almost gave an eye roll. Dr. Wasserman almost gave an eye roll when he heard the argument that it was possible or that it wasn't feasible to believe that. Elijah Hickson was in shock when Dr. Hickson found out that somebody would insinuate that it did fit. I don't know of a single person who's examined this manuscript or any textual critic today who would look at Codex A and say it was possible for it to fit, because the work has been done on that manuscript to show it would require a large amount of extensive space to do that. So, but since there's a gap there, I'm not going to say I'm 100% sure, because I'm not an absolutist. I work in the weight of the evidence, and I think the weight of the evidence is very high.
So
what's your thoughts, Jonathan?
What manuscript is it that we were talking about? Is it Codex A?
Codex A, Alexandrinus.
Which, and I've got it pulled up here, and I just had a question real quick, and I want to turn it to you, Jonathan. It says that in what I'm looking at online, it says there were 2 leaves of Codex A which were lost, which you mentioned, but it leaves from the word katabainon in 650 to the word legais in 852. So it seems like those would be the 2 leaves. So even if, I'm wondering what the strength of the argument would be to say it probably wouldn't be in there, or it should be in there, based off of that codex, when those 2 leaves it jumps from 650 to 852. So how would you respond to that?
Is that to me or Jonathan?
Well, it would be to you first, and then I want to get Jonathan's take on that as well.
Well, again, the research has been done to see if that amount of leaf could have fit those entire 12 verses on there. And Andrew Smith made a tremendous case for it at Sheffield Seminary. There's no point in trying to entertain something that the work has been done on. I don't think we need Codex A to make the argument that I have of the eclectic side of things. The reason I used A was because it's the earliest Byzantine witness. I think that the argument isn't changed one way or the other on that one single manuscript. The only reason I brought up A, I didn't bring up others. Like, I didn't bring up Codex W. In fact, I have a facsimile of Codex W here at the house. It's not in Codex W, but there's other uncials that don't. But again, when we go back to the argument is, where's the evidence? And there's weighted evidence and research done on the manuscript that shows it's just not going to fit.
Yeah.
And I think I think the textual critics who heard that in the interview were not only shocked, they had an eye roll for it.
Jonathan, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, for me, to make the case on Codex Alexandrinus, obviously Bergen did extensive research and looked into this issue, and obviously due to maybe technological advances that were not available at his time, was able to conclude that you can't make a case for it or against it. My point on this particular matter is, let's say it's against the PA for whatever reason. We know in the ancient world there were manuscripts that did not have it. So whether we add one more to the bucket, 2 more, 10 more, we know that manuscripts in the ancient world did exist that did not have this passage. I think the bigger question is providing the naturalistic explanation for how it not only entered into the text, the liturgies, but also into the art in both the Greek, Latin, and some of the Aramaic textual traditions. So spending a large amount of the time to prove or try to focus on Codex A, which we already know that there's manuscripts that didn't exist. I don't see how it helps his case or takes away from Dr. Boyce's case, because there's a lot of unknowns. Even if it is, what does that establish? It doesn't tell us how it got into the actual churches, into its liturgies, into its art, and at least 3 different textual traditions in the ancient world. So I think it was an opportunity lost to actually focus on some of the bigger issues. And why fight for a minor detail when you're missing the actual issue that we need to discuss? And I know Dr. Boyce brought it up, the history and transmission, the origin of this particular passage.
Okay, so it seems like to me, and I'll just want to recap this so that I understand it. Maybe those of you who are listening are in the same boat as me. The argument is that there's 2 leaves that are missing in Codex A. If you're looking at the size and the font and the usage throughout Codex A, based off of those 2 leaves, if you were to include the PA in those 2 leaves and using the same size and font and spacing and all that, it would not have the PA included in it. So that would be an argument for Codex A, saying that it's an argument against the inclusion. So is there anything else that you guys wanted to?
Yeah, I'll just say, a scribe had a tendency, and if you look at Codex A, it was a very well done manuscript, and they used this certain amount of lines on each page and consistent, so you can duplicate. You can duplicate with words by computerization. I'm telling you, I think Dean Burgon would have loved to have a computer that could remodify ancient manuscripts, letter sizes, line upon line, measuring it from top to bottom, and try to duplicate from the Byzantine text what it would have looked like in Codex A. I think it would have been exciting. I think Burgon would have probably done a better job with it than what we're probably doing with it right now. But that's the beauty of technology. I mean, that's the beauty of the abilities that we have to look at these manuscripts. So I think, again, I'm not an absolutist. I don't work in absolute certainties without it. But the evidence, I would say, is very close to the 100% mark. And no, we don't know what would have been marked there. Lectionary marks, asterisks. We don't know what would have been marked there. But we can make a strong assertion that it doesn't belong, and it wouldn't have fit in the leaves that are missing.
So one thing before we move on to the next portion of the clip is to point out that obviously there's the eclectic side of what we would use for the considerations regarding the internal, external, and the historical side. It seems like, Jonathan, you focus primarily on the historical side, and Stephen, that's kind of the sidebar for you, where the external would be the biggest point for you and what you study with all the manuscript evidence side of it. But everybody's looking at the internal to an extent. And obviously you guys are a lot more well-rounded, but one of the examples, and I'm sure we'll get to it, would be the historical support, which I'm sure, Jonathan, you'll bring this up at some point with the patristic and versional support as well. But I'm not sure, where do you guys want to go as far as that point? Is there anything you want to hit on, or do we want to keep going with the clip there?
I think we keep going. You good to keep going, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think we spent already enough time.
All right, we'll keep rolling.
He did now here on Codex A.
Okay. All right, here we go.
My challenge to the whether or not Papias' reference to the sinful woman before Jesus in the Gospel of the Hebrews, whether or not that is a reference, in fact, to the woman taken in adultery. There's no way really to prove that that was what Papias was making reference to, correct?
Well, it seemed like everybody that followed Papias on that later would assume that it is exactly what he was talking about. And I haven't heard any other theory, and maybe you have. I'm not saying they're not out there.
Who else is, you said everybody who followed after him, who else has definitively shown that that is a reference to the pericope adulterae or to the woman taken in adultery? And it doesn't explicitly say that.
I'm not talking about in history. I'm talking about scholars who study the quote from Eusebius, because Eusebius was actually not even talking about the Gospel of John there. He was in a section on the apostles. And he added some additional things that he knew of these writings. To me, the story fits the description. And the fact that it was quoted supposedly from the Gospel of the Hebrews, and then you see guys like Didymus.
All right, you can pause it right there, Josh, because it's going to bring us to our next. Jonathan, why don't you jump in first, since you love the empirical data and church fathers? Why don't you start on the comment about his view of Papias' quote?
Okay. I think it's important when we look at all the evidence is really to consider it for its worth. From my standpoint, I know Bergen pointed it out as well. I think it's a strong illusion when we look at what he's citing. It takes us what best explains what he's referring to. And I know Bergen understood that it's a good, strong allusion to the woman in adultery. From my standpoint, looking at the passage, what else other do I draw my attention to except the account of the adulteress initially looking at the passage? So I think it would be strong evidence or a strong allusion. I mean, we can't say for sure because he doesn't quote chapter and verse that didn't exist yet, but I think it's a good indication that's what he's referring to. He is the bishop of Heraclius. He was a known associate of the apostles. My only question is he brings up the Gospel of Hebrews. And from my standpoint that, and I'm just speculating here, why would Papias or the bishop of Hierapolis actually appeal and bring up the Gospel of Hebrews, except that the Gospel of Hebrews is taking scripture that is found in the Gospels and putting it into the Gospel of Hebrews. We know that the Gospel of Thomas resembles a lot of our earlier four Gospels. We know Marcion took from our information as well. There's stuff that the Gnostic groups and communities were taken from not only our canonical Gospels, but our other New Testament documents as well. So while I think it's I think it's a good allusion to the woman in adultery. Definitely, Bergen saw that. There's others that do. I think it points us back to the churches and back to the canonical Gospels. My biggest point I'd make is if its origin did originally lie in the Gospel of the Hebrews, based on the documentation we have from the ancient churches with Tertullian, Irenaeus, heavily attacking the text of the Gnostics, what bishop of which apostolic church would be okay with implanting a Gnostic script, whether they thought it was original or something that Jesus said? Who would have the cojones to really put it into their churches, in their texts, in their liturgy? So that would be my biggest concern about it. What bishop would allow Gnostic documentation to be supplanted in the canonical Gospels, especially after it's been taxed? So I'll let you give your thoughts, Dr. Boyce.
Yeah, and we could play the video in a second because it's going to bring me into my second part. I think, like you said, we're back on the head being chopped off illustration here. No, I'm not going to have my head chopped off for it, but we're looking at different evidences. We're looking at similarities. And we know that the gospel, the Hebrews, from Eusebius's account, was a regularly used gospel by Jewish believers in Alexandria or in Egypt as a whole. They enjoyed that gospel, and it was not listed as a heretical gospel by Eusebius. It was a rejected one, but it certainly wasn't placed in the category of what he called impious and wicked, like the Gospel of Thomas. And he even mentioned the fact that the Jewish believers found delight in that gospel. And then we find later that there's a man named Didymus the Blind who is in Egypt, and he's also alluding to this story as well. And he chose to say the gospels, plural, which will come up in just a second on the video. He mentioned the gospels, plural, and he said certain gospels. He was making a distinction with that term, certain. So it wouldn't be unrealistic to believe that he was familiar with this work of the gospel of the Hebrews, and that this story that was conveyed by Papias that Eusebius records would be connected to something that Didymus had. And it should be important to note that he didn't mention specifically John, and he put gospels in the plural, and he used the word certain before it. So there could be a connect there as well, that he was familiar with this document. Again, Bergen illustrated kind of an idea of, yeah, this goes along with the story. It seems to be there. There's others that did as well. And I think it's our earliest witness of the story in its earliest form. But if you want to hit play, we can kind of build on that, because now Didymus the Blind is going to come.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get to this. And obviously it seems like what the implication would be if he made references, which some people say that he does. He does quote specifically John twice with Papias writings, but what I would ask is, it seems like the implication is the reference for the Gospels in generals, as reference to the Gospels in generals, or the Gospel of the Hebrews, is that he's making a reference that that's where it was actually included originally. So, and I would just ask you, Stephen, do you believe that it was originally in the Gospel of the Hebrews?
I do think that it was. I don't know if that was the original placement of it. I don't think we can say that at all, because unfortunately we lost the Gospel of the Hebrews outside of citations such as Eusebius right there. I really wish we could. And I don't remember who I was talking to the other day. They were talking about how great it would be if somebody just unburied a full copy of it, like the Gospel of Thomas. Because honestly, I think we'd have better use of it than the Gospel of Thomas. But I continue to say that this source of the story, I do believe goes back to apostolic tradition, and that's why I went back and stated, is it possible that there's a story that is true? And I want to be clear about this. I believe the story is true. Can a true story that happened in history about Jesus exist without being inspired? I don't think this story was made up out of thin air by some guy sitting on the top of a tower on the city wall one day and decided to make this up. I think that we see different versions of this story. As Didymus brings up, the style of the story that he presents is not identical to the style of Papias, and it's definitely not as lengthy and detailed as Didaskalia. So again, where's the origin? That's what we're all arguing for. And some will take the empirical data and say, well, it goes back to the empirical, which is Jonathan's view. My manuscript lookings and examinations show it's not even in manuscripts that represent within a very close time frame. I don't think it originated in the Gospel of Hebrews, but I think the Gospel of Hebrews, if it contained it, would have gotten it from a similar source as these other documents, like Didaskalia in Syria, like Didymus the Blind's quote. I certainly believe that they had access to the story, and I do think it's a real story. I don't deny its historicity. I deny whether or not John wrote it.
Yeah. And I know we'll get to questions at the end for the audience, but it related to this specifically while we're here. Buck Daniel asks this. He says, Stephen, can you explain how this could not have referred to, quote unquote, certain gospel books? How would you respond to that?
Is he talking about the Gospel of the Hebrews? Maybe I'm
I
misunderstanding.
would assume so. Maybe I missed a comment back there, but I think that's what he was making a reference to.
If he's talking about the Gospel of the Hebrews, I don't know what the fact is I know that some would assume that Didymus was talking about Gospels being the collective four Gospels.
Right.
And again, maybe we all have our viewpoint of that, but I don't think that resolves why he would say certain Gospels, because Didymus was not shy about mentioning Gospel names.
Yeah.
He wasn't shy about giving credit to Luke. He wasn't shy about giving credit to Matthew. So why here did he have it in John's gospel? It's possible Didymus had it in the manuscript of John. Did he also have it on his other hand in the Gospel of the Hebrews that they were reading as well? We don't know, but he certainly didn't limit it to one. And the fact that someone say collectively, I just don't think that works. I don't think he was. Because it's not in the Gospels collectively. It's in John's Gospel. And anytime these church fathers cite a specific Gospel, they were consistently mentioning the name of the writer with it. I don't know your view, Jonathan. What's your thoughts?
Yeah. For me, when we're looking at the history of the Church of Alexandria, I mean, obviously, Origen gives us a list of the documents that were cataloged and received at the Church of Alexandria. Obviously, Athanasius, specifically does a big discussion on limiting out any apocryphal works, and shows from the standpoint of the Church of Alexandria, these are the ones that are recognized. Didymus, who was blind and probably didn't see anything, what use of Braille he had. Obviously, as the head of the catechetical school at Alexandria, I think it would, from my standpoint, as a teacher at Alexandria, the history of the documents, Athanasius did a good job of really separating out any apocryphal type of works for the Church of Alexandria. I think the natural assumption would be he's referring to the Gospels themselves, the canonical Gospels. I'm trying to understand why he would appeal to a story that he said Jesus, the Lord, if it's from a Gnostic gospel, which wouldn't have any credibility. I think the bigger thing, and it's more circumstantial, is that both Jerome and Rufinus met and learned from Didymus the blind, and we know where they put it. And Jerome, the textual scholar he is, provides no history that he understood it from being from the Gospel of the Hebrew, and he understood it as a portion from John. So I would say on the Didymus quote, I would think as the teacher he was over that area for the catechumens, I think it would lean. I know Ehrman sort of thought it leaned towards the Gospels, but once again, both Dr. Boyce and I can't read his mind. And because of that, it's hard to be sure apart from circumstantial evidence.
Yeah. Well, here's what we are sure about. If we just concede to the fact that, and Jonathan's correct, a lot of those documents by Athanasius were expelled. In fact, that's probably why a lot of the tradition continued to expel those documents, where the manuscripts of the Gnostic Gospels were found in Nag Hammadi buried in jars. They were probably buried because they were illegal to have and they were being expelled from the land. And that's why they've been preserved all this time, because somebody was burying them to preserve them. And Athanasius was very adamant about expelling those kinds of documents out of the land. The problem, I would say, with the Gospel of the Hebrews is it was not considered Gnostic as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth and so forth. But I will say this: let's concede and say he was talking about the Gospels as a whole. What we do know is that the reading of the story that he gives is not identical to the story in John's gospel. Adultery, for example, is not mentioned. We don't see him mention a woman caught in adultery. The whole story, the narrative that plays out with the Pharisees and Jesus's dialogue, the writing, those aspects are not in his citation of it. We see a version of the story, but even if it was John's gospel, it was clearly in a different format, and it's not entirely with the same details of the manuscript or like in the TR or even the majority text of today.
Okay, so
I think we can go to minute 5.
Minute 5,
I think
okay.
is perhaps another spot. I think he gets into the proto.
All right, here we go.
Produced by Luke, and it was a part of the Elston. In your article, you've gone even further and said that it was part of Proto-Luke. You've got a lot about the fact that it was included in one tradition in Luke's gospel, and you say that's very, very significant. But all of that was 1,000 years after the Gospel of John was written. And
Okay, can you pause that?
thousands of years.
Back to, not to rehash the proto-Luke argument about the full purpose of the document. We don't know, and I certainly don't know, and I'm not claiming that Luke did actually originate the story. I do think it goes back to the apostles. It's very possible it goes back to Luke, the terminology connecting to Didaskalia, et cetera, et cetera. That is fully a theory that's been chased down and studied. I do not make a decision one way or the other on that. We're all trying to get back to the origin. That in the article was just an opportunity to examine another thought process. I never concluded and even said it should be rejected, even in textual criticism, of belonging in Luke. But it does have an origin, and that's where we're at. Now, I think it should be noted that the wording, like being Lucan or Johannine, even Scrivener, who is the father of the TR, so to speak, of today's TR, his 1881 and so forth, Scrivener actually believed that this story was not in the original first draft of John, and others did as well, Alford and other great Anglicans like Jonathan over here, when they examined because again, Burgon and Scrivener, they didn't find this as some done deal of study. These guys were the ones that were constructing and defending a certain text, Burgon specifically, the ones that were passed down through the church, and then Scrivener coming as well, doing the same and compiling what most people use today for the TR. Scrivener did not believe this belonged in the first edition. He believes that parts of John 5, the last chapter of John, Scrivener and Alford believe that this was added in a second edition to John. Now, I don't see any evidence of that. I think the churches would have certainly noted something that significant. But what that indicates to us, though, is that Scrivener recognized that the wording and the timing and the placement seemed not to be in an original flow of thought, and that John would have actually come back and included it in a second edition. And I know the prologue and the epilogue, people believe that John went back and added the first section of his first chapter and the last chapter and so forth. But Scrivener, the TR proponent text of today by most TR only advocates, even believe there was something about this story that didn't fit that first edition, believing that John went back and added it in that placement. So it's not bizarre, it's not insane, even in those who defend it belonging, to see some uniqueness, difference, syntactical difference, odd placement, odd timing. It's not ridiculous for people to view that, because even Scrivener struggled with it belonging in the first edition of John. And you being an Anglican, Jonathan, defend your Anglican Scrivener.
Well, I do defend. I do defend Scrivener in many ways. He was an Anglican. We both accept the apostolic polity. Both probably believed in the 39 Articles of Religion. Obviously, they are a product of their times, and a school of thought was being introduced. I know Greisbach kind of thought there was something else that was added in at the end of Mark, a second edition from the ancient patristics. We have no indication regarding their editing process. All we know is that version was authorized to be read in the churches, and from what we can tell, there was no documentation that talked about updates, or they linked up to the cloud with their text of the New Testament, got it updated in their database, and that's what it was. Regarding the question of Luke, and that's probably where I wouldn't agree with Scrivenger on there, but just because we have no empirical data to support that statement, even if it did happen. I think in regarding to, why does it show up in Luke? Obviously, earlier I made my, discussion on the history of election cycle. I think one important point that would seem reasonable to me in there is, once again, this passage was moved over to October 8th. And we do know that on October 7th, early in Luke, verses 12 to 9, serve as the reading for October 7th. So if I would have to, the way they're setting up their readings, as I showed before, you have different churches setting up their readings differently throughout the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches. So we do see a lot of differences in there. And if you're thinking you're going to take out a portion of Scripture and add it to an existing election cycle on October 7th, does it make sense just because it's going to be on October 8th? Or are you going to just lump it in there because it's easier to do? You already have October 7th, which is going over Luke. Do we take this, since we're moving it over to October 8th, does it fit better here in the election cycle? But, that would be my thought.
Jonathan,
in addition,
are you willing to have your head chopped off for that?
No, because I didn't get to speak with the lector or the scribe who was actually setting up those readings for the church. I would have to pass. But my other point, and it is speculation, I think the point on moving it to the day of repentance does kind of help satisfy the view that maybe she did eventually repent. Now, once again, that's just my conjecture. I think the purpose of bringing it to October 8th is to calm the nerves of the people in the conversation, like she was just given a free pass. So I think that plays into the argument as well.
Yeah, and Nick Sayers brought up a good point about Bergen as well, kind of on a side note, that he formulated kind of the concept of the majority text. I think Bergen would be closer to a majority text advocate today than more of a TR, because he was for revision. I mean, he wasn't against revision. He wasn't against studying these passages and so forth and looking at all the evidence, which, again, goes to prove, and maybe we'll talk about this more later, but Dr. Riddle had mentioned that this issue was settled in the churches. Numerous times he said that in the debate. It was settled in the churches. It was settled in the Reformation. Well, Bergen didn't believe that. Scrivener didn't believe that, and they were after the Reformation. There was arguments being made about this passage way past the time we see the tradition of the Byzantine text really taking off and making numerous copies of this. He also said something, and I don't know, Jonathan, your view on this either. He said 1,000 years later. Now, you're a TR advocate, so I will be careful how I state this. It's hard to take a TR advocate serious where they're going to dismiss a concept on manuscripts that came 1,000 years later when there are numerous readings in the TR that are not supported by any manuscript within 1,000 years of the original. There's numerous readings that came in later editions of manuscripts that are not in the first 1,000 years. And it's just like, I don't even know how to take that kind of criticism. Well, this is 1,000 years later. Well, there's numerous readings in the TR that don't have Greek support, and hear me carefully so I'm not misquoted all over the internet again, Greek support that are pre-1,000 years. So I don't know. That was just kind of odd to me that a TR advocate would use that argument. I don't know your view on age and date.
You know, and I'm probably going to speak more about this later regarding provenance or what were the witnesses by the churches, because if we're talking about the text received by the churches, so, you know, John sent out his copies from Ephesus out to the independent Greek, Latin, and Aramaic churches, I'd be concerned specifically with what documentation that was received and what documentation was transferred down through those channels, the churches themselves that are witnesses. We know that other things existed out there. The one point I'd make about the Reformation is, remember, this all begins because Lorenzo Valor actually takes 4 copies of the Vulgate, and he takes 4 Greek texts. We know Constantinople was raided by the Turks. Turks were coming over into Europe to flee from the Turks. So obviously we had access from texts coming over from the Greek Orthodox churches. And because of Lorenzo Vala's analysis, obviously Erasmus was very influenced by the work of Lorenzo Vala, is they noticed that there were discrepancies between the textual tradition that had come down in the West, obviously represented by the Latin Vulgate, and the texts of the Greek Orthodox churches. So this is why we see Cardinal Jimenez beginning his, thorough project on the Polyglot. And we also see why Erasmus is taking to this study as well. So it's because of these differences that they felt was important enough to spend resources, get approval from the Church of Rome, to start researching and investigating manuscripts, that the editions of the TR was created with the purpose of resolving the differences between the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic ecclesiastical texts. So that was the scope of what they were trying to do, which brought about the TR. And obviously, the scholars of Europe, which I felt had a better understanding of how the ancient churches were set up, how they were able to transmit their writings, that is why I'm able to say, I can accept their decisions because I think these were the greatest scholars in Europe. They understood the differences between these manuscripts. They understand how the ancient world operated, and this was the textual decision that they came to trying to resolve these problems.
Well, and I've told you this before, probably in past conversations. If I was a TR advocate of any sort, and this might be insane to some people, the Complutensian Polyglot to me was a better edition than Erasmus's edition. So I would probably take that one more serious because of some of the things that were done in Erasmus's editions due to rushing, limited hands-on manuscripts, etc. So to me, the TR, but you would have to admit, Jonathan, that there are readings that have no Greek support at all in the TR, just Latin or very, very little Greek that came much later after 1,000. So that's really a bad argument for if you, a TR only advocate, would say you can't use that argument, so to speak, because that's 1,000 years later. Well, isn't that kind of odd coming from a TR person?
Well, remember, I think there's a difference between Dr. Riddle and I, and obviously it's not meant out of disrespect. Edward Hills, in his King James in his work defending the King James, the Byzantine text, he actually notices that there is a difference in the High Anglican view of the Textus Receptus. He points out that Bergen, Scrivener, Edward Miller, and other high church Anglicans understood it differently than Edward Hills, and he plainly states that like Bergen and the church, they kind of only recognized 3 ecclesiastical bodies because they were the successors of the apostles. We can trace back, and that's why Bergen placed so much emphasis on quotations and writings of the bishops of the apostolic churches. I think his point, I understand where he's coming from, and I think this is where Dr. Riddle would probably appeal more to on Edward Hill's. But, you know, for me, we have to understand how these churches were set up and organized. And there was an actual mechanism set up by the apostles to ensure that the text that was handed on to their successors was transferred and secured down through their channel, the churches, up into posterity. So what we're arguing for or appealing to is actual mechanism to secure the transfer and control of the text, which then becomes the witnesses to establish these readings as both apostolic and Catholic, in the sense that it's universal. It can trace back to the apostles.
So I've got 2 points that I wanted to jump in on. One is the first point that was brought up there with see, I'm a TR advocate, and saying that there's no Greek manuscript support for many TR readings. It is something that obviously a TR person would have to take into consideration, and I would take into consideration myself. It is and ask for examples, like what would some of those examples be, but and we could examine those. But that's the same for the critical text, and I think you would say the same thing. There are readings in the critical text that don't have any Greek support in any manuscript, so it would go both sides there. But one thing that I would ask is, when we're talking about the Proto-Lucan origination, is in something that I was just thinking as I was listening to you guys talk about this, it seems a little peculiar to me to argue a Proto-Lucan origination if you really believe that it was original to the Gospel of Hebrews. I'm not sure what the connection would be there, but that's just something I was thinking about as you guys are talking, and I'd like to, what's your take on that?
Yeah. I don't think it was original to the Gospel of Hebrews necessarily. I think if the Gospel of Hebrews truly contained the story, it came from a similar source that also produced it in the Syrian reading of the Didaskalia. I'm not saying that that's the first gospel that had it. Papias seemed to allude to that one having a story likened unto the one we see in John's gospel, which is probably an early citation of it, but he references it to the Gospel of Hebrews, which actually tells us that the Gospel of Hebrews is probably late first century. So it would have been an earlier book, because Papias was at the end of the first century, into the second century. But I don't think it originated from Hebrew. I think that the Gospel of the Hebrews received that story from a source that would also be the same source that put it into Didaskalia, which claims to be the 12 apostles.
So you would agree with Tommy Wasserman that it was probably it was an interpolation from a Greek manuscript into the Gospel of John in that case?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Wasserman very, very much on that. In fact, he and I have talked about it in video chats and so forth. But yes, and to answer your other question about are there readings, and again, we have to remember there's different editions of the Textus Receptus. I mean, there's numerous editions that read differently than others, from Beza to Stephanus to even the Complutensian Polyglot. There are definitely readings. Erasmus obviously borrowed a reading about the Book of Life in Revelation 22 rather than the Tree of Life. There's no Greek manuscript that survives today that has the reading Book of Life, because I personally believe, and I know that friends of mine would argue against me and say, no, he wasn't borrowing from the Latin there. But there is no Greek manuscript that has Book of Life. There are Latin manuscripts, but there's no Greek manuscripts that have Tree of Life. But in the critical text, yes, there's different editions. And I have actually, and I know Elijah Hickson has done the same thing, like in 2 Peter chapter 3, the Nestle and Allen 28th edition, we see the word not inserted there. And there's a lot of dispute amongst the critical text people right now, like, because the Nestle and Allen changed it, but the Tyndale text did not. And I actually lean with Elijah. I don't think that 28th edition of the Nestle Allen is right. I don't agree with it. And so we do see things like you're saying, even the critical text, because that's coming from a Coptic, an old Coptic tradition is where they're inserting that in 2 Peter 3. And it's kind of mysterious as to why they did it. But at least in that text, there are notes at the bottom of the manuscripts that do not have the word there.
Yeah.
Whereas the TR really doesn't provide a database of manuscript differences. But there are examples, yes.
See,
and ultimately, I hope that answered your question.
That it does, and that's one of those questions where it's like, man, you know what? It's good to hear you say, like, man, I disagree with that, and there's speculation as to why it was put in there, why it's in there, and that's where I'm like, man, I want to get your take on that, but I know we've got to move on, we've got other stuff to get to. So, anyways,
minute 16 would be a good spot there because I think I need to make a clarification for the whole world to hear.
All right, minute 16. Let me get there. All right, here we go.
Manuscript witness to the pericope adulteri.
Okay. So 14 out of 300, you didn't count them. IGNTP, it's 050709.
All right, go ahead and pause that. Sorry, I guess I gave you we heard the second half of that. In this, it was me recalling a statement that Dr. Riddle made about many ancient uncials, and this is where all the conspiracy theories bloomed from there. My main point in that, and actually I had talked to numerous people after the debate about better clarification or should have stated this, should have stated that more clearly. Before I went into the debate, I counted the uncials that did have it. I did not go back and count the ones that did not. 16 do not contain it that we can tell, possibly 17. And again, how you view Alexandrinus would dictate that number as well. Obviously, I know that all 300 uncials do not contain the Gospel of John in that section. And there's more than 300. I'm giving a roundabout number. Obviously, I recognize the fact that they do not contain all of that. The clarification statement is that he made a general statement. In fact, I talked to Dr. Riddle slightly afterward, and we discussed a couple of things. But the statement was many of the uncials contained it. Well, there's over 300 uncials, and 14 out of that mass, even though they don't cover John, he made a general statement. And generally speaking, that's not accurate, just as it's not accurate for me to say many of the uncials lack it. There's more that lack than more that have, but it's just as wrong for me to say many lack it. My main argument in the article, as well as in the debate, was not the number of uncials, but the date of the uncials. And the date of the uncials, to me, was the bigger argument, both made in the article and so forth. But I did talk to a couple of my friends, and I'm not opposed to positive criticism. Jonathan and I have actually discussed this as well. Other TR advocate friends of mine have discussed it, and critical text. And actually, I'm going to modify it so it doesn't sound misleading. I'm willing to admit I probably should have worded that different. I understood what I meant by it, and it probably didn't come out the best way, and it probably needs to be updated a little bit more specific, not general, even in my article. I'm totally fine with that. I'm not opposed to that. But the point of the matter is we got so distracted on this statement that we missed the fact that Dr. Riddle said many uncials contained it, and he made a general statement amongst the uncials. He didn't say many of the uncials that covered John contain it. And that might be because he needed to clarify his statement as much as I needed to clarify my statement. I'm willing to give him the massive benefit of the doubt. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts?
No, not really. I think I think the point has already been belabored enough. I think it's important to note when you're having these discussions. And I've been them as well in other discussions I've had, is that you're trying to recall, you're trying to go over information, and I don't think there was any ill intention when Dr. Boyce was speaking on that or tried to mislead or represent it in his favor. I think already clarified the statement probably more than he had to. So I think from that regard, 14, for me, it still comes down to provenance. They can have 300 unknown documents. I think it doesn't really make a case, except we know that there was documents and have it. But I would just leave it at that. I don't think there was anything Dr. Boyce was doing to mislead or misrepresent the evidence in his favor. I think he made the clarification already, so I don't think there's anything I can add of value to that.
Yeah. So I would just say, man, I think that's pretty honorable to be able to take a step back and go, you know what, I see where people are saying this is what it looks like is being said. And obviously you've got the quotations from the article, you've got the quotations from the debate, and that's probably this number that people are drawing out on from those two different points of what you've written and what you said in the debate I think that's.
I was speaking in general terms, like if there was an opportunity for it to appear in all the manuscripts, if there was an amount to appear in the unsealed totality is over 300.
Yeah.
No way in shape or form do even a tenth of those actually cover that section of John. None of them earlier than Codex D have it, which is 5th century. The earliest before that, we're talking P66 of the papyri, P75, Aleph and B, and as I mentioned, Alexandrinus or W. When we look at those, I was more so arguing both concepts. The earliest, one of the most relations of the West being from Sinaiticus, because the first 8 chapters of John and Sinaiticus are Western predominantly. Alexandrinus is Byzantine in the Gospels. P66, P75 are obviously the earliest witnesses of anything, because they're within probably about 100 years of the original writing of John. And then you have Vaticanus, which I think is one of the most important manuscripts that we have to date. And most of my argumentation was coming from that, recognizing, yes, but as an opportunity of how many could have, we've got over 300, but the problem is not all of those cover John, which Dr. Riddle recognizes, and I recognize, and don't need to belliger that point. But the point of the matter is there's just as many opportunity to lack it as there is to have it. Neither one of them are significant to the argument. That's why I appeal to the date, both in my article and in the debate. Yep. If you, I think minute 17 or the 17th minute there.
Yep.
There might have been a talking point. I know Jonathan's going to probably jump in on this one as well. Minute 117 or hour 17 to hour 18.
Okay. Yeah, let me play that.
That emerged in Christianity that affirmed this passage as authentic and inspired and as part of the proper text of the Gospel of John.
Okay, so with that, in these manuscripts, are you saying that all of them read the same way? And I'm not talking about minor variances. Are you saying that they're consistent with each other?
Is what consistent with each other?
Our manuscripts tell the story with the same details and the same way. Are they consistent with one another?
It depends on how you define consistency. I mean, given that you're in the pre-printing era and all these things are handwritten and hand copied, there it is. And also given the fact that you talked about Maurice Robinson working with von Soden material and tracing the differences, some of the textual differences in the transmission of the Pericope Adulterae. Given the challenges to the Pericope Adulterae, I don't think it would be surprising that there would be a number of variations. I mean, there are variations in passages that aren't even as disputed. So as long as there is a tradition of handwritten copies.
All right, pause it right there. There was a statement where I don't know if anybody else caught this in the debate. He actually he never answered the question about which one's the right one, and that's the issue that we're running into in this debate: is which ones are consistent with each other, that are the preserved ones that have been passed down. And Dr. Robinson has laid out the statistical charts of Mu 5, Mu 6, Mu 7, in addition to the 7 that von Soden produced, recognizing that you can't build this story without, and Dr. Robinson condensed it to 3, And even if you pull up a majority text, you'll see he inserted the move 5, move 6, move 7 in the sections of which that data was provided for which streamed reading. And I never felt like I got an answer from which one is the consistent one that was preserved all the way through. And he says there's variations in other passages that are not that are also disputed. Well, the problem is this is one of the biggest disputed. We're not talking about a small variant here. We're talking about 12 verses. This is one of the variants of variances, along with the long ending of Mark. I mean, these are usually the first two that come up in textual criticisms, the first two you study in textual criticism courses. So where we have consistency, there was never an answer. Where do I go to find the correct version of the story? Because we really can't make the story the way it is without piecing together even Byzantine streamed readings. Now, Jonathan, you have a different view because yours isn't so much on that manuscript evidence, although you include it. Yours is empirical. So what is your view with your position, though, because you do recognize there's many different streamed readings, some starting in different places, some ending earlier, different details. How do you resolve that with your position?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that there is variation. 70, 80. The question is, can the account be recognized? And that is true. It can be recognized. I think what the variation does establish, let's say even in the text of the Greek Orthodox churches, is if they're coming from three different streams, there's an eventual source back to that stream that is independent of each other. So from my standpoint, the fact that there are differences, there is variation, there is a lot of variation. The fact is there is a recognizable account that did exist that those streams are drawing off of, which they would have got from their text. And the fact that there's, you can correct me if I'm right, three different streams in the text of the Greek Orthodox Church shows that they weren't copying from each other. So I think from my standpoint, there wasn't collusion on this passage, because if there was very minimal variation, apart from the scribal errors or misspellings, you would say that there was collusion on the part to include this story. But the fact that you have three different streams with differences in them go back to a common source that's coming from the church. So did all those different streams make up this account collectively? Because if they did, they would have a consistent stream. The fact that the variation exists in the Byzantium alone, not to mention what we find in the Latin, shows that there was no collusion on the part of one editor or two editors, but you have three different streams that leads back to an identifiable account for this narrative.
So I'd like to kind of piggyback off of that and just ask you a question, Stephen, is when we're talking about the location of it, and we're talking about the earliest records of where it would have been located and how we would know that it could have been located in John, and what's the best evidence to show that the earliest point we would see it is where it would be. So the what I would look at is obviously not evidence that for the inclusion, but the recognition that it was there. And that would be for the four earliest witnesses being P66, which shows a dot marking the omission where it would have been located, and then P75 showing the dot and space mark at the location where it would have been located. But then Sinaiticus shows a space and dot marking the omission, showing it was recognized and known, but omitted as probably a reference that there would reject it as a variant. But then you see also on 1361 in Codex Vaticanus that there's the double dot markings over in the column, in column 3, and then there's another column there as well, showing that they recognized that it would have been there, but they were rejected. So what would you say about that as being a witness for the location through omission?
I don't think P66 is using that. I don't think that mark is a notification of knowledge of a text. I think that's just a part of the the marking of the scribe there leaving a punctuated section. I don't think that it's necessarily a saying, oh, well, there may have been something here, but we skipped over it. And that would be true in some of these other manuscripts as well. My issue is not with the fact that if it's going to be placed in the manuscript tradition, it shouldn't be in John. I actually think that there's more evidence for it to be in John than in Luke. Again, the Lucan thing is chasing down a theory about why certain manuscripts put it there, whose mother manuscripts went back to the 7th century. Also, a high emphasis on didascalia. In John's gospel, what we see in some of these streams, like verse 6, is different. Jesus writing on the ground's not included, or some contain what Jesus, was writing. Some start in verse 3. There's different readings there, and my statement is, and there's inconsistencies between the papyri and Aleph and B and some in Alexandrinus in places. Of course, there's differences even in the Alexandrian field. The problem is we in the critical text position don't hold this view of perfection, or Dr. Riddle's view, kept pure through all ages. Well, if it was kept pure from all ages, then that should be accounted for. But what we see is a lot of coming together of different streamed readings, this piece, and differences. Which one was the pure one kept through all ages? That's not an argument I would ever make, because I don't believe in that system. So I would reject a lot of these streamed readings. My only thing to Dr. Riddle was because of his confessional belief. Tell me which one should I go to find the kept pure one in all ages. Is it move 5, move 6, move 7, the combination of all three, the one that ended up in the TR, the way Codex D had it worded? I don't believe every single word is as important as somebody with a confessional position. Yeah. So my question was geared towards, where do I go to find that one? Or did it just work itself out in the Reformation and God, which he pretty much answered at the end, and I'll give him credit for that, that it was resolved. It was resolved at the very end in the Reformation. And to me, that just, so what's the point of the data? It really doesn't matter about textual variances. It really doesn't matter about which manuscript had it, which did not. And again, we look at the church fathers and we say, well, this was settled. At certain points. I know Dr. Riddle had mentioned that a couple of times. It was settled in the Reformation. He said it was settled pretty early on in the churches. But we see even guys like Euthemius, who examined in Byzantium, in Constantinople, in the 12th century. He was looking at the best of the manuscripts in the Byzantine family, and he said that they lacked them in most of the best manuscripts. That's in the 12th century. And most of the manuscripts that contain it are Byzantine. Well, why is that the case? And is he a full-fledged liar? I mean, or did he just have a decent opinion? So I don't see where it was ever really settled. I don't see where we can definitively run away with it even in the Reformation. I don't think the Reformers saw it that way either. And then, like I said, Burgon shows on the scene. Scrivener shows up on the scene afterward. They're looking at the data, and they're still interested in investigating and not saying, well, it was just settled, we don't need to investigate. They were still in investigation mode. So, Jonathan, what do you think about that, about the empirical church settling this thing at some point? What do you think about the settlement of the text?
Yeah, I think when we relate to this scripture alone, I know Bergen kind of reserved this section as last, as one of the most difficult problems at all. I know he understood it as a difficult problem. We know this passage of scripture was attacked or kind of spoken against in the ancient world. So I think when we look to the information, we see, from Augustine time, from Ambrose to Nikon, even in the 12th century with, I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not going to crucify it. But obviously, it's important to understand the history of this passage, that it was attacked in the ancient world. And going from Augustine's time in North Africa, where there was problems, obviously in Ambrose's congregations in Milan, and even in Nikon's time with the Armenians, there is throughout history a pattern where this passage was attacked. And for that to go away, Obviously, this is an issue. It's something that I think is important. Obviously, early on, there's issues as far as it being settled. Once again, the reformers noticed that there was a difficulty or differences between the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic ecclesiastical texts, and they set some of their best scholars to work on resolving those differences. Now, in the particular case of the PA, the decision that they came to within their textual editions obviously unanimously supports their conclusion or how they felt the evidence leaned. Obviously, as discussions came up in the Church of England with Hort, this discussion was revisited. So as a matter of it being settled, obviously it depends on which group you're looking at, but it is an issue that does require our investigation. And obviously, if new evidence comes in that changes that, obviously it's important to look at that. So,
what do you think about Euthemius? And I know you're familiar with this quote about this. Euthemius was 12th century in Constantinople, talking about the better of the manuscripts not having it. Should we just disregard that, or just say, hey, this was still a dispute even in Constantinople?
Well, the thing about however you pronounce his name, he was a monk in Constantinople, and I think it's important to look at his witness or his statement on there. It's kind of interesting because, he points out certain key factors in that statement, and, how do we resolve it? Now, I think I do run into a little problem because I have a statement from Eusebius who says it's not found in the most manuscripts. But we do know, even in the time of Theophylact, also with Eusebius, around this time, this is a majority reading in the Syrian Byzantium text form. So the manuscripts of those periods do represent this as a majority reading in there. So, so the question I have, or the point I have to make is, do I accept someone of the Middle Ages who is making a statement that seems contradictory to the extant manuscript evidence for the Syrian Byzantium text form that actually has this as a majority reading? Obviously, I'm not trying to assume that there's any ill intention on the part of Eusebius' statement, but I think it's important to investigate what he said, because I think he also points out that, it's not mentioned by Chrysostom or Cyril of Alexandria. So I don't think from reading the statement that there's any ill will. I do have to factor in that throughout history, there has been a noticeable pattern in North Africa, in Milan, obviously by the Greek Nikon, that there was animosity towards this passage. So obviously, my
question to you, Jonathan, isn't so much about whether or not that settles the issue of, he's right, Jerome's wrong, or Athanasius, whoever, any church father you want to quote before that, like you just mentioned. The question is was it settled? It doesn't seem from a comment like that, whether he was wrong or just looking at a limited resource, it would still indicate that this text of dispute was not a settled issue somewhere in church history, even in Byzantium. I guess that's my main point.
Yeah, well, I think the scholars of Europe came to a resolution or a decision on this matter. And obviously, in the next couple hundred years, there was further disputes. As far as it ever being settled, it depends on who you ask. I think the scholars of the Reformation made a decision on there that they came to unanimously on this particular, whether it was settled in their mind, they were able to reach a decision on there.
Well, let me ask you this, Jonathan. One of the presentations, and I actually got accused of throwing I don't want to use a wrong word here because I've been in trouble all week with I threw a bad move into the conclusion that I did by referring to it not belonging contextually in John, when actually, if we were to go back to the beginning of the discussion in my introduction, I mentioned it with the statement of hoping that we'd be able to discuss it in the cross-examination, but Dr. Riddle chose to go after syntactical conclusions that I even myself would not make one way or the other. But I made the comment that there's a interruption in the text with the story of the woman caught in adultery, because on the last day of the feast in verse 37, which was the great day, the priests would go down to Siloam and in their gold basins bring the water to the altar where Jesus just happened to be sitting on that day. He refused to participate in the tent making on the Feast of Booths with everybody else. Rather, he demonstrated that he wasn't going to sit in just a tent representing the presence of God, dwelling of God. He physically sat in the temple. And on that last day, when the priest brought this water from Siloam into the temple, they were singing the Hallels. The people were chanting and singing in the Jewish tradition, and they would circle around the altar 7 times with this water, pouring it out, representing this salvation that God gave them when he gave them water in the wilderness, going back to their roots in Egypt. And then they would shout, Hosanna, save us, the priests would. And so Jesus on that last day used their practice and their tradition to say, whoever is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, and out of him will come rivers of living water. He was saying, this tradition that you've been doing all this time, I'm fulfilling. And then there was a second tradition in the feast, and that was the feast of holding up lights. They would lanterns at night, representing God's protection and direction when they left Egypt with the fire. And Jesus comes out, and there's this dispute at the end of the chapter, like no prophet comes from Galilee. But actually, if we go to Isaiah chapter 9, we find that from Galilee, a light was seen out of darkness. And then Jesus comes in verse 12 and says, I am the light of the world. And he claims to be that light that was brought into the darkness of the world, pointing to their lantern, saying, I'm the light, I'm the water. He's using object lessons. And then when we get into chapter 9, we see him telling a blind man who can't see, who needs light, to wash himself in which pool? The pool of Siloam that the water came from, that was poured on the altar, to give a real-life miracle demonstration of this healing. But the problem is, if we put the pericope adulterae into this passage, what we find is Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and everybody goes to their house, and then the next day, they're bringing up this discussion with Jesus with this woman, and then he's saying, I'm the light of the world. But it seems contextually, what that would have done actually is push the second aspect of the fulfillment of their feast of the lights, which was on the last day of the feast as the water basin. You would have actually pushed the ceremony a day late in fulfillment, because another day would have gone by. Whereas if the story is not here, both aspects of this story are being fulfilled, the water and the light, on the last day, as they were doing in the tradition of the Jews, and this miracle of the man with the blindness. What are your thoughts about that? Because I really wish we could have spent some time on that. I mentioned it in my introduction, but sadly we weren't able to discuss it.
Yeah, so first, as far as your closing, I know you did reference it in your opening, I believe. And then tactically at the end, obviously, as a point to facilitate more additional discussion. Actually, as a tactical move, I don't personally see anything wrong with that. I know in my concluding remarks, even in my debate with Dr. Richard Price before our question and answer, I did throw in some additional information that I wanted to segue into a further discussion that we hadn't already covered in our opening statements and just some of the cross-examination. Now, as far as this passage sitting between, from my standpoint, it is an interruption. So there's a couple of things to be made about that. Obviously,
Did you say it was or it wasn't, Jonathan? Did you say?
No, I said it is an interruption.
Okay.
Obviously, there is an interruption here, and so when I'm thinking about it, you have this big, you have all this going on, and there's an interruption supplanted in the passage. So, from my standpoint, John, who would have been a witness to that, which side would it being original? Because who would just supplement an interruption in that linguistically? It doesn't make sense, except if during what was going on, putting pressure on Jesus, they wanted to bring this circumstance to him to kind of put him in a difficult position. How are you going to handle this? Because the law in the Old Testament has us deal with adulteries with stoning. So from my standpoint, I think the interruption would weigh in the favor, because what scribe or editor would make such an interruption to that passage of the flow unless John was there and this interruption occurred and they came out of nowhere to surprise Jesus, to kind of keep him off guard, to deal with the situation that is addressed many times in the Old Testament, dealing with the law.
Yeah, I'd like to take a stab at that if I could, Stephen. So when we're I know that I'm sitting back and listening a lot to this, and I'm not arguing that it is an interruption or that it wouldn't be an interruption. Obviously, both Jonathan and I would be arguing for the authenticity of it. But if you look at Culpepper's work on the internal evidence, the internal analysis of the PA in relation to the rest of John, look at what he does in comparing John 5 to John 7:15 through 24. And the quotations that he uses in citing the similarities and the relation of these two stories back from chapter 5 to chapter 7. And then look again at what he does in chapter 6 through John 8, 1 through 11. And in 6:14, and I won't go through the whole thing, but you guys can look this up online. It's Culpepper's work on the internal.
Well, and I want to be clear about something, Josh. I don't believe that everything about the story lacks Johannine view. The point that I was making earlier was that there's also views that aren't in here that seem to line again back with the Lucan thing. I'm not saying that there's no evidence of John at all in the story. Now, to pin it down to the two things. All right, so he's talking to the Pharisees are debating amongst themselves, and there's a conversation about check the scripture. Hey, see if a prophet comes from Galilee, and it's like Jesus interrupts this debate about a prophet coming from Galilee and just says, "I'm the light of the world." I'm the light of the world. And so if we go back to Isaiah's prophecy about Jesus is answering them from Isaiah 9, which they would have instantly been recognized from this place of Galilee. Then it says, light was seen out of darkness. So for Jesus to actually say that statement next would have probably brought them to an Old Testament passage they were very familiar with about the Messiah coming, and Galilee's a part of the equation. Now, that brings us to the second point. Do interruptions happen in the scripture? All the time. Right. Interruptions happen all the time. The question is, this interruption would not just be an interruption that even Scrivener recognized and said, this is probably a part of the second edition of John. Again, I don't think Jonathan or I agree with Scrivener on that, but he recognized this does seem like an interruption enough where he would say that it was actually placed in the second edition, not a first edition. But at the same time, though interruptions happen in Scripture, this interruption would have placed his fulfillment of their feast practices that he was trying to point. The Feast of Tabernacles is all about me. All the practices of the water was always about me. I'm your salvation. You're chanting Hosanna, and I'm saying to you, if you believe in me, you'll have water coming out of you like a river. Rivers of living water springing out of you. They're holding up the lanterns for their practice in the Feast of the Light. He's saying, I'm the light. All of these things you're practicing that go back to the Egyptian symbolism of deliverance that took you out of Egypt, I'm that salvation. So if we put the story there, it's not just an interruption. It's an interruption that actually puts the second perspective of the festivity of fulfillment of the lights a day after the feast is over. Because if we go to chapter 7, verse 36, it's on the last day of the feast that they did this water tradition and the light tradition. And if the story of the woman caught adultery is there, it actually pushes us out of the feast, which is 7 days long, into an 8th day. Not that it can't happen, but it's like, well, that kind of just deflated Jesus's ultimate point of what he was pointing to in Isaiah's prophecy of being the water, which is Isaiah, and being the light, which is in Isaiah as well, pointing to him being the ultimate fulfillment of those things. I don't have a problem with interruptions in Scripture, but this one would have actually delayed his second fulfillment of their practice.
So what do you think, where would you place, and just real quick, where would you place Jesus entering the conversation with the Pharisees to kind of interrupt their conversation, to bring the conversation between the Pharisees and you? Where do you place that if the PA's not in there?
Well, they're all in the same location. I mean, they were just having a discussion with each other. He's watching the priests do their duties. The Pharisees are discussing conversations about him, Nicodemus. And then he just leaves the temple in chapter 9, and he runs into the blind man who he spits on the ground, makes clay, puts it on his eyes, tells him to go to the pool of Siloam, again, the pool where the water was. So it's obviously they were all in the same vicinity, and it's like they're having this conversation and debate about him. And listen, they didn't have a problem talking about him or to him or negatively towards him. They were already mad at him. They were seeking to arrest him already. That's why they were concerned about him going to this feast to begin with. His time was not yet come. It wasn't his hour. So they were already ticked off at him, but he didn't mind engaging them. And by the end of the chapter, he's saying, hey, before Abraham was, I am. The dialogue never stops in the text. If we read it the way it is, the conversations are happening around him and to him and back to him and around him, all to the point where he finally leaves the temple, heals the blind man in the pool with the pool of Siloam.
Yeah. Okay, so we're at almost 2 hours. We've got 2 more clips that we wanted to get through, but I want to see where you guys are at and where you want to go with this.
We're at the very hour mark. I mean, there's a lot that I guess could be stated more as well, Jonathan. To me, the argument goes back to the data. I know Jonathan's is different than mine. We differ on this. We've probably talked, Jonathan, I don't know how many hours we've discussed this passage alone, but your argument's going to be more on the empirical data. I look at the earliest witnesses, the way to the manuscripts. Considering that there's so much discrepancy, even when it's consistent in a certain manuscript passage and in a certain field, it seems like, and I agree with Dr. Wasserman, that it originated from the West. That's why we see it first show up in Codex D. We didn't get to talk much about this, and I know Jonathan really wants to talk about this, so I'll give him this chance. Jerome talked about many Greek and Latin manuscripts containing this story, obviously, in John. In fact, I was actually a little disappointed we didn't get into some of these discussions in the debate with Jerome, but Jerome mentioned many Greek manuscripts, many Latin manuscripts. Well, Jerome was in the West, fully recognizing that he went down to Alexandria. He had a team of researchers. Jerome was doing a lot of work to compile what would now be the Latin Vulgate, and Jerome had a team working with him. He wasn't doing it by himself. But I agree with Dr. Wasserman. It seems the origin came from the West. And all of these many manuscripts that he talked about, obviously, unfortunately, we don't have any of those representations that came from his stash that he said many. Augustine mentioned, and Jonathan, you could talk about Jerome and Augustine. Augustine mentioned it was being taken out because of the controversy about, seemed to like produce this concept of women getting away with adultery almost. But I don't think that answers the absence of for Augustine's time. I don't think that answers the East. I don't think that he's in North Africa. That doesn't answer the absence of it in the other manuscripts in different jurisdictions. But it's certainly something that we can't sit there and say, oh, that's dumb. Augustine made that up. No, I think he was probably telling the truth there. And Jonathan, I know you wanted to talk about Augustine and Jerome, so knock it out.
That's good, man. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand, and I know Dr. Boyce actually referred to Dr. Wasserman's theory. And, you know, I think when we look at first what's being said, that, you know, and so we have to understand this was supplanted or began in the 3rd century. We know that John created his book at Ephesus. It was sent out to the churches. It's well recognized, obviously, prior to the 3rd century in both Greek, Latin, Coptic, Aramaic. This book was well established throughout the independent apostolic churches throughout the Roman Empire. Now, what that means is that it not only that it was distributed all over, is that all those copies didn't have this passage originally in them, which means that when we get to Dr. Wasserman's theory, is that its origin begins in a Greek manuscript sometime in the West, and then it makes its way to supplant itself in both texts, the liturgy, and the art in both Greek, Latin, and even in Aramaic, because we see in the apostolic constitutions, the bishops putting it in. We have a mechanism problem or a distribution problem on how this can physically be done without the aid of an ecumenical council, without any type of ripple effect being shown. And you know why this is important, because remember, the churches are, the churches that were set up by the apostles and flourished and came down into the 4th century. We're not getting this hypothesis or this story coming out of those that were appointed to oversee the churches. And I'll get to Ambrose and Augustine and Jerome in a second, but it's interesting that the Bishop of Milan, specifically Ambrose, who was appointed as bishop over that church, specifically states, that it's in the Gospel of John. The passage is very famous. He speaks nothing of it being supplanted into his copy that had come down to him, or any known history of any type of this passage wasn't original to John. Now, what Ambrose does say pretty specifically is that this scripture, which was in their lectionary system, showing that this gospel lesson was read to the congregation, caused the offense because of what this passage came to be understood, that the woman kind of got off scot-free. So there's no history from Ambrose that this was a passage not original to John at all. And remember, the Church of Milan goes back to the beginning. These are apostolic churches. He's a bishop appointed to the episcopate. His job was to oversee the texts of Scripture and to faithfully hand it on. So when we see from Augustine in North Africa, and which we'll tie back to Jerome here in a second, is that once again another bishop of the Apostolic Church in North Africa, which roots go back to the beginning as well. They have apostolic succession, they can trace back. So in one of these channels in North Africa, the text of John has this passage. So not only did this passage would have to been supplanted in northern Italy, and there's no indication from the bishop overseeing that area that such a history was common to that area. In North Africa, Augustine comments multiple times on this particular passage and specifically makes the allegation that the passage was not added but taken out. Once again, Augustine is highly respected in the ancient world. He's a credible witness. The Greek Orthodox Church references him in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. He has standing, and I think his statement should be taken seriously. And we actually have an allegation that's specific to this discussion Dr. Boyce and I are having, where it's taken out for moralistic reasons. which corroborates the problems that another bishop in Milan, that obviously was Augustine's mother's bishop in Milan, that he referenced. So, and if you think about it, Jerome at the same time is working on a massive project for the text. He's already explained in his preface to the Gospels that he's investigating textual matters, that there's large degrees of variation, and the scope of his project was to resolve these issues, to actually create something much more standardized to deal with these issues. He's trained by Gregory Nazian, so he's obviously been over to Constantinople to learn Greek. He's been over to Didymus in Alexandria, and he has an entire team. And even from Jerome's statement, where he makes that the passage of the woman in adultery found in the Gospel of John, so once again, another reference to the Gospel of John from Rome, North Africa, and Ambrose, where it's all pointing to, he says it's found in many Greek and Latin. So the tradition is in two major traditions of the apostolic churches. So he does indicate that there's some that didn't have it, but his specific project was to deal with this issue. And I think that, the greater thing about Jerome is we understand what his methodology was. So he's doing it by a comparison of Greek manuscripts, and he only used ancient manuscripts. So in 383, and think about it, he's in Bethlehem, a very dry climate. What does ancient mean in 383? Is that 3rd century? Is that 2nd? That could be 1st. He's obviously well informed of what the issues need to be. And on this particular passage, it passed Munster on his Vulgate. The bishops of North Africa, who was very concerned about what he was doing, especially in light of his translation of Jonah, which caused a big spark in the North African church that got Augustine involved to write to him. He was being watched. They went through the Gospels, and in almost every passage, they found nothing to object to. Marcellus was also very concerned that Jerome wasn't changing anything, and he wrote to him as well. So, for me, the big problem is we have a very credible fathers of the ancient church that are thoroughly investigating textual matters of this particular time, and we find this passage throughout the ancient world. I mean, we see it in Spain, we see it in North Africa. There's an allusion to it in Didymus and Alexandria. Obviously, Jerome references it on not only in his letter to Pelagius, but he talks about Jesus writing down on the ground. And in not any of these instances do they say that the passage was interpolated. But what Augustine provides, which is later also brought up by Nikon, is that the passage was being taken out, not that it was being added. So obviously, I don't want to take the whole time. I want to give Dr. Boyce an opportunity to respond. But the problem is you have to get it into all these locations, the liturgy, and also in its culture, without anyone noticing. And the history common to these areas demonstrate clearly that they were very aware of attempts to adulterate the text of Scripture, and what bishop would allow it. And because all these churches go back to the beginning, the natural assumption would be that it was always in the text. And the reason why we find documents, manuscripts that don't have it, is because of these allegations that they were being taken out.
Yep.
And I'll
Yeah, I before I jump on that, Jonathan, and I know it's getting late here. Jonathan Beasley had mentioned the fact, and I think it needs to be reiterated because I've read, I've probably been misrepresented more in 1 week than my whole life put together. I have never inserted, and anybody can go look at it. I never inserted that the story originated at Luke. It was in that, like, that's it. Luke created this story. It goes back to him. I make a case that there's good argumentation for it, building off of Kyle Hughes's work that Dr. Wallace gave him to investigate that got published. And like I said, even Keith looked at it and said that it should be considered. I certainly will not stand behind it to the extent of I am 100% sure this came from Luke, or I think I have the best argument in the world that makes it a Luke. I was chasing a theory that's been investigated in the academic world about why it ended up where it did, the Lucanisms, all of those things assorted. So to be clear, I never said that this story originated from Luke. I'm not going to dismiss it, but I certainly am not going to dogmatically state it that way. As far as what you're saying, and I know that you have to make an empirical draw on this, on the church recognizing it. My draw is going to come from the evidence of the manuscripts that are before all of the men that you just mentioned. So we're talking about it being taken out. Don't deny the fact that happened with Augustine's statement of it, but we have to factor in at some point it was also added in. We can't just argue one side of it because the earliest ones don't have it. We don't have anything earlier in 5th century that do have it. And I think you would recognize this too, even Jonathan, that some of the earliest translations don't have it. Like in the Coptic churches were considered solid churches. The Sahidic side of it did not have it. The Ethiopic witnesses, the Gothic, Armenian, and the earliest of the surviving manuscripts from those regions don't have it. And that's consistent with the earliest Greek as well. There's even Latin texts that don't have it. There's Latin texts that do have it. There's Latin texts that don't have it. So, we could see where people are saying, well, it was taken out in places. Well, that doesn't explain the rest of the world being taken out in certain places. The earliest witnesses of the surviving text, whether it be translation, whether that be from the manuscripts themselves, we are within 100 years of the original autographs of John with P66, P75, consistent transmission from P75 to Vaticanus. We see consistency in those things, and they don't have it. I don't think we should ignore all of the empirical data that you talked about because they obviously recognize this issue. They obviously recognize the variant existed, missing in some and is in other. The difference between you and I, Jonathan, is I think it was added later and not much later after the original, not much later after P66, P75. I don't think it just started in the 5th century, but the earliest surviving data of the manuscript tradition, not just in the Greek, but also in these other regions. And we have to deal with the fact that the way that they're described by these fathers and the way that they're described in all the other translations, the ancient translations, do not read exactly the way it reads in the Textus Receptus of today. There's details missing, statements missing, there's even adultery missing. There's a lot of problems, even if it consistently belongs there, where we have to figure out, well, which one's the right version of this?
Yeah, my point, and it's true. There is documentary evidence, obviously with P66, P75. Obviously, you have Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Obviously, Dr. Wasserman also pointed out that the provenance of these texts are suspect, in the sense that we don't know who the authors were. We don't know which groups they belong to. We don't know if it was actually read in any apostolic church. While I do believe they're well put together, I don't believe they are Gnostic renditions. But I think it's important to note that we had other groups out there, such as the Monetists. We had schismatic groups like the Novatians. And so there were Orthodox schismatic groups or sects outside that weren't Gnostics that were Orthodox in many ways that we could see not having them. So the problem that I have with some of these core texts is they don't look like the texts that are found in the actual churches, that we do understand the history, the bishops that were overseeing them, and their liturgy. So what we find is, are those texts represented of the texts of the earlier Greek Orthodox churches? And I can't make because we don't know where they come from, it's very hard to say that. But we do know who Jerome was. We know his methodology. We know he had a team. We know he had Greek manuscripts. And we know that the epicenters of Christianity in North Africa, Marcella's letter, everyone was making sure that he was staying true to what he was saying. And his text had to be vetted. So his Greek text is an early witness. I know Bergen points out that, those old Latin lines go back to the, early 200s. So not only in the Latin, but the Greek documentation he has, these churches all go back. And what we see throughout the churches is their churches, and that requires a physical mechanism to get through. Something that, earlier attempts to try to supplement the text into the churches didn't go very well. Tertullian brings up about the attempts at Ephesus to bring in writings falsely under the name of Paul. Yeah. That presbyter was relinquished of his duties. So they were very observant. And now, while I'm not going to say that it couldn't be possible that they could supplement the text, of course they could. Could they get it into a church? Possibly. Bad leadership. We find that all over. Bishops are being deposed.
I think you would agree, Jonathan, that whether it was inserted or deleted, depending on your position, both of those are massive. It would draw attention one way or the other. And the funny thing is it didn't draw attention one way or the other. The only evidence of it being actually removed, the way that Augustine described it, which was only one section of the world that he was familiar with that being done at, even if it were inserted or deleted, the church as a whole didn't seem to comment on one way or the other. And so I think at the end of the day, and we'll probably wrap it up here, Jonathan, but obviously you go off the empirical data, I look at the manuscript data, and that's where you and I go separate ways. And I'm a former Baptist that's recovering. You're an Anglican, so I'm still praying for your salvation. But it was good, and I think this is a good spot for us. And I think it's a great argument. I think that is the argument for it belonging is actually Josh is Jonathan's view of the empirical data and how he references Ambrose as well as he does as Jerome. I think that is the best argument. I think it's a better argument than a lot of the typical arguments you hear from the Textus Receptus arguments. I think it actually makes the most sense. Yeah. I still think there's consistency issues. I still think there's how do we know which wording of it is right? But I think if there is an argument that should be made, I think Jonathan actually has one of the better arguments for it.
See, and that's what I was telling Jonathan maybe a couple of weeks ago. I was like, dude, you've got one of the best arguments of anybody out there. I mean, because his argument with the chain of custody is really good. I think that when you look at the references of the ecclesiastical usage as it being documented and circulated and accepted, and in conjunction with forgeries and heresies and all of these things that were rejected at the same time, I think that he does have a really good argument. I'm looking forward to seeing what he does with Richard Carrier coming up later this week. That's going to be a lot of fun. So, the evidence, again, like you and I were talking about, Stephen, we're all looking at the same evidence. I think that at the end of the day, whether it's, I can't tell you what it is. I haven't been able to put my finger on it, but whether it's a bias or a presupposition or something is separating the different camps saying, well, it's authentic, it's not authentic, because you're saying, well, it's an interpolation from the Greek to the Greek. It was early because it's referenced in the Gospel of Hebrews. Maybe Luke wrote it, maybe he didn't, but at some point somebody brought it into John. We don't know who, we don't know when. And Jonathan has got an argument that goes, we know who, we know when, it's been here and here and here, and it made it over here. And, it's like, gosh, man, I need the evidence to see, like, who brought it in, when did they bring it in, when was the first time that we saw it in the Greek, who introduced it, like, why wasn't it recognized? And that's something that Jonathan brings out, is like, man, we noticed all these other false gospels come in, we noticed the stuff that Marcion was bringing in. Why didn't we bring this up? Like, why is it just now an issue? Or at least, so...
Yeah, and where I usually push back on Jonathan, he'll just push back and we get nowhere. But is that though these statements are made about him being early and many manuscripts in the Hebrew, the Latin, and the Greek, when we look at the manuscripts that predated those men, none of them have it. So it's kind of like, I'm not saying they're all liars, but at the same time, the physical evidence that survived in these other manuscripts that represent different jurisdictions, it's like, well, I can see what they're saying, but there's still evidence where it looks like it was added later. So it's not a done deal for me in that way as it would be for Jonathan. And but I like Jonathan Sheffield. Like I said, I'm still praying for his Anglican self to get saved. But other than that, we're pretty good friends about it, even when we sit here and talk on the phone for hours about the differences of views on different texts and stuff. So I appreciate Jonathan taking his time. He's busy. He's got a lot going on, and he and I have talked about this for hours on end as well. As our desire is really to go out and discuss the canon and text to atheists and things like that. And there's opportunities right down the road for me where I'm going to be engaging more of that, and talking canon is far more exciting for me than textual criticism, although I love both. But I appreciate Jonathan. He's busy, and he took the time to come out and review this with me. I wanted to get an opinion so that I just didn't get an amen choir. It seems like that happens a lot, and I didn't want that. I wanted to do a very balanced as possible examination.
That's good. I'm glad that you guys came out and were willing to come on and to do this, and for letting me participate a little bit. I kind of interjected there. I know it's supposed to be mostly between you guys, but I'm like, man, I want to jump in on some of these. But you know what? It's good. I'm glad we were able to do this. I'm glad you guys were willing to do it. And it's getting late. I mean, we're at 2 hours and 20 minutes. Yeah. Normally we would go to questions from the audience, and I know that you guys have got a ton of questions, but I've got to get up for work in about 4.5 hours. So yeah. Anyways, Jonathan, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
No, the purpose of coming on here with Dr. Boyce was obviously to go over, my views on the debate review. Obviously, we couldn't spend hours like Dr. Boyce and I talking about the PA, so I just want to go over some of the central arguments, how I look at things. Obviously, as an Anglican, these aren't specifically my views. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Augustine argued in a very similar fashion as well. So I think I don't want to take all the credit for it, but I'm kind of plagiarizing their statements from the ancient world. But I think this was a really good, healthy discussion. Dr. Boyce and I are not going to always agree on everything, but I think we both understand that we have a reverence for Scripture and establishing the preservation of the text. And I think we have very good intentions on both sides in making our argument.
That's good stuff, man. Awesome. Well, I think that's going to be a wrap for today's episode. So thanks again for coming on. You guys are both welcome back anytime. And good luck with Dr. Carrier and everything that you're doing there. And Stephen, I know you're busy with ministry stuff and life and work and all that. I mean, so yeah, and all these debates. And so, yeah, it's good to see you active out there and watching the, and for me to be able to watch those and piggyback off of it. So thank you guys for contributing and for coming on tonight. So
thanks, Josh.
All right.
Thanks, Josh.
Well, have a good night. I'm going to cut to our closing scene here and give you guys an update where we're going, if it's going to cut to the closing scene. Having issues with my tech. I need to get a better computer, guys, so we'll figure it out. All right, so looks like coming up, don't forget this weekend on May 31st, 2 p.m., I'm debating the Eucharist with Matthew Broderick. We talk about the means that God uses for salvation. One of the means that a Catholic uses as an argument that you have to receive the Eucharist in order to obtain salvation is what we're going to be debating this weekend. I think that's a huge topic when we're dealing with salvation. And for me personally, is it the finished work of Christ, or is it the finished work of Christ and something that you have to do? And maybe I'm oversimplifying it there, but that's something to consider, guys. That's a good debate with Matthew Broderick. I know that he's had a few moderated debates in the past and has been doing this for probably 20, 30 years or so. But then we've got Kevin Thompson again is coming on June 28th at 2 p.m. That'll be a good conversation to talk about Calvinism. We both think Calvinism is wrong. He gets a rap for being an anti-Calvinist. If you know much about anti-Calvinism, you've heard of Kevin Thompson. So that should be a good conversation as well. And finally, we've got the eschatology debate on the 14th with myself and Stacy Turbeville. He's a full preterist, and I'm a partial preterist, so that'll be a good conversation to take consideration as well when you consider Matthew 24, Luke 21, Daniel 9, Revelation 6 through 19, and various passages that deal with the end times. So stay tuned for all that, guys. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Please like, share, subscribe, and help get this video out there, and for the audio as well. Don't forget, we are on all the audio podcasts, the major ones at least, if you want to listen on audio as opposed to visual. So anyways,